Number 5 of A Christmas Miscellany 2017 by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 5, The Clan Christmas by George MacDonald. By slow degrees, with infinite subdivisions and apparent reversals of change, the autumn had passed into winter indeed. Cloud above, mire below, mist and rain all between, made up many days. Only, like the dreariest life, they were broken through and parted, lest they should seem the universe itself, by such heavenly manifestations, such gleams and glimpses of better, as come into all lives, all winters, all evil weathers. What is loosed on earth is loosed first in heaven. We have often shared of heaven, when we thought it but a softening of earth's hardness. Every relief is a promise, a pledge as well as a passing meal. The frost at length had brought with it brightness and persuasion and rousing. In the fields it was swelling and breaking the clods, and for the heart of man it did something to break up that clod too. A sense of friendly pleasure filled all the human creatures. The children ran about like wild things. The air seemed to intoxicate them. The mother went out walking with the girls, and they talked of their father, and Christian, and Mr. Sercombe, who were all coming together. For some time they saw nothing of their next neighbours. They had made some attempts at acquaintance with the people of the glen, but unhappily were nowise courteous enough for their ideas of good breeding, and offended both their pride and their sense of propriety. The manners and address of these northern peasants were blameless, nearly perfect indeed, like those of the Irish, and in their own houses beyond criticism; those of the ladies conventional, where not rudely condescending. If Mistress Connell was an exception to the rest of the clan, even she would be more civil to a stranger than to her chief whom she loved, until the stranger gave her offence. And if then she passed to imprecation, she would not curse like an ordinary woman, but like a poetess, gaining rather than losing dignity. She would rise to the evil occasion, no hag, but a largely offended sibyl, whom nothing thereafter should ever appease. To forgive was a virtue unknown to Mistress Connell. Its more than ordinary difficulty in forgiving is indeed a special fault of the Celtic character. This must not, however, be confounded with a desire for revenge. The latter is by no means a specially Celtic characteristic. Resentment and vengeance are far from inseparable. The heart that surpasses in courtesy, except indeed that courtesy be rooted in love divine, must, when treated with discourtesy, experience the worst revulsion, feel the bitterer indignation. But many a Celt would forgive, and forgive thoroughly and heartily, with his enemy in his power, who, so long as he remained beyond his reach, could not even imagine circumstances in which they might be reconciled. To a Celt the summit of wrong is a slight, but apology is correspondingly potent with him. Mistress Connell, however, had not the excuse of a specially courteous nature. Christina and Mercy, calling upon her one morning, were not ungraciously received, but had the misfortune to remark, trusting to her supposed ignorance of English, upon the dirtiness of her floor, they themselves having imported not a little of the moisture that had turned its surface into a muddy paste. She said nothing, but to the general grudge she bore the possessors of property once belonging to her clan, she now added a personal one. The offence lay cherished and smouldering. Had the chief offended her, she would have found a score of ways to prove to herself that he meant nothing, but she desired no mitigation of the trespass of strangers. The people at the new house did not get on very well with any of the clan. In the first place, they were regarded not merely as interlopers, but almost as thieves of the property, though in truth it had passed to them through other hands. In the second place, a rumour had got about that they did not behave with sufficient respect to the chief's family, in the point of whose honour the clan was the more exacting because of their common poverty. Hence the inhabitants of the glen, though they were of course polite, showed but little friendliness. But the main obstacle to their reception was in themselves. The human was not much developed in them. They understood nothing of their own beings. They had never had any difficulty with themselves. How could they understand others, especially in circumstances and with histories so different from their own? They had not a notion of how poor people feel, still less poor people poorer than before, or how they regard the rich who have what they have lost. They did not understand any Huftian feeling, not even the silliness they called love, a godless, mindless affair, fit only for the doll histories invented by children. They had a feeling, or a feeling had them, till another feeling came and took its place. When a feeling was there, they felt as if it would never go. When it was gone, they felt as if it had never been. When it returned, they felt as if it had never gone. They seldom came so near anything as to think about it, never put a question to themselves as to how a thing affected them, or concerning the phenomena of its passing through their consciousness. There is a child eternity of soul that needs to ask nothing, because it understands everything. The ways of the spirit are open to it. But where a soul does not understand, and has to learn, how is it to do so without thinking? They knew nothing of labour, nothing of danger, nothing of hunger, nothing of cold, nothing of sickness, nothing of loneliness. The realities of life in their lowest forms as in their highest were far from them. If they had nearly gone through life instead of having but entered upon it, they would have had some ground for thinking themselves unfairly dealt with, for to be made and then left to be worthless, unfit even for damnation, might be suspected for hard lines. But there is One who takes a perfect interest in his lowliest creature, and will not so spare it. They were girls, notwithstanding, who could make themselves agreeable, and passed for clever. Christina, because she could give a sharp answer, and sing a drawing-room song. Mercy, because as yet she mostly held her tongue. That there was at the same time in each of them the possibility of being developed into something of inestimable value is merely to say that they were human. The days passed, and Christmas drew near. The gentlemen arrived. There was family delight and a bustling reception. It is amazing. It shows, indeed, how deep and divine, how much beyond the individual self are the family affections, that such gladness breaks forth in the meeting of persons who, within an hour or so of the joyous welcome, self getting the better of the divine, will begin to feel bored, and will each lay the blame of the disappointment on the other. Coats were pulled off, mufflers were unwound, pretty hands were helping, strong hands were lifting and carrying. Every room was bright with a great fire. Tea was refused and dinner welcomed. After dinner came the unpacking of great boxes, and in the midst of the resultant pleasure the proposal came to be made, none but Christina knew how, that the inhabitants of the cottage should be invited to dinner on Christmas Eve. It was carried at once, and the next afternoon a formal invitation was sent. At the cottage it caused conference, no discussion. The lady of the new house had not called with her girls, it was true, but then neither had the lady of the castle, for that was the clanspeople's name for the whole ridge on which the cottage stood, called on the newcomers. If there was offence, it was mutual. The unceremonious invitation might indicate that it was not thought necessary to treat them as persons who knew the ways of society. On the other hand, if it meant that they were ready to throw aside formalities and behave heartily, it would be wrong not to meet them half-way. They resolved, therefore, to make a counter-proposal, And if the invitation came of neighbourliness, and not of imagined patronage, they would certainly meet it in a friendly spirit. Answer was returned, sealed with no mere crest, but with a coat of arms, to the effect that it had been the custom since time forgotten for the chief to welcome his people and friends without distinction on Christmas Eve, and the custom could not be broken. But if the ladies and gentlemen of the new house would favour them with their company on the occasion, to dine and dance, the chief and his family would gratefully accept any later offer of hospitality. Mr. and Mrs. Peregrine Palmer might do them the honour to send. This reply gave occasion to a good deal of talk in the new house, not entirely of a sort which the friends of the chief would have enjoyed hearing. Frequent were the bursts of laughter from the men at the assumption of the title of chief by a man with no more land than he could just manage to live upon. The village, they said, and said truly, in which the greater number of his people lived, was not his at all. Not a foot of the ground on which it stood, not a stone or sod of which it was built, but belonged to a certain Canadian who was about to turn all his territory around and adjacent into a deer forest. They could not see that, if there had ever been anything genuine in the patriarchal relation, the mere loss of the clan property could no more cause the chieftainship to cease than could the loss of the silver-hilted Andrew Ferrara handed down from father to son for so many generations. There are dull people, and just as many clever people, who look upon customs of society as on laws of nature, and judge the worth of others by their knowledge or ignorance of the same. So doing, they disable themselves from understanding the essential, which is, like love, the fulfilling of the law. A certain Englishman gave great offence in an Arab tent by striding across the food placed for the company on the ground. Would any Celt, Irish or Welsh, have been guilty of such a blunder? But there was not any overt offence on the present occasion. They called it indeed a cool proposal that they should put off their Christmas party for that of a ploughman in shabby kilt and hobnailed boots, but on their amused indignation supervened the thought that they were in a wild part of the country where it would be absurd to expect the savoir-vivre of the South, and it would be amusing to see the customs of the land. By suggestion and seeming response, the clever Christina, unsuspected even of mercy, was the motive power to bring about the acceptance of the chief's invitation. A friendly answer was returned. They would not go to dinner, they said, as it was their custom also to dine at home on Christmas Eve, but they would dine early and spend the evening with them. To the laird the presence of the Lowland girls promised a great addition to the merrymaking. During the last 30 years all the gentlemen farmers of the clan, and most of the humbler tacksmen as well, had vanished, and there was a wide intellectual space between all those left and the family of the chief. Often, when Ian was away, would Alister, notwithstanding his love to his people and their entire response, have felt lonely but for labour. There being in the cottage no room equal to the reception of a large company, and the laird receiving all the members of the clan, poor I was going to say, and rich, but there were no rich, as well as any neighbour or traveller who chose to appear, the father of the present chief had had good regard to the necessities of entertainment in the construction of a new barn. Companionship, large feasting, and dancing had been even more considered than the storing and threshing of his corn. There are in these days many who will mock, but for my part I am proud of a race whose social relations are the last upon which they will retrench, whose latest yielded pleasure is their hospitality. It is a common feeling that only the well-to-do have a right to be hospitable. The ideal flower of hospitality is almost unknown to the rich. It can hardly be grown save in the gardens of the poor. It is one of their beatitudes. Means in Glenruadh had been shrinking for many years, but the heart of the chief never shrank. His dwelling dwindled from a castle to a house, from a house to a cottage, but the hospitality did not dwindle. As the money vanished, the show diminished. The place of entertainment from a hall became a kitchen, from a kitchen changed to a barn. But the heart of the chief was the same. The entertainment was but little altered, the hospitality not in the least. When things grow hard, the first saving is generally off others. The Macruadh's was off himself. The land was not his, save as steward of the grace of God. Let it not be supposed he ran in debt. With his mother at the head, or rather the heart of the affairs, that could not be. She was not one to regard as hospitality a readiness to share what you have not. Little did good Dr. Johnson suspect the shifts to which some of the Highland families he visited were driven, not to feed but to house him, and housing in certain conditions of society is the large half of hospitality. Where he did not find his quarters comfortable, he did not know what crowding had to be devised, what inconvenience endured by the family, that he might have what ease and freedom were possible. Be it in stone hall or thatched cottage, the chief must entertain the stranger as well as befriend his own. This was the fulfilling of his office, none the less that it had descended upon him in evil times. That seldom if ever had a chief been Christian enough or strong enough to fill to the full the relation of father to his people was nothing against the ideal fact in the existent relation. It was rather for it. Now that the chieftainship had come to a man with a large notion of what it required of him, he was the more, not the less, ready to aim at the mark of the idea. He was not the more easily to be turned aside from a true attempt to live up to his calling, that many had yielded and were swept along, bound slaves in the triumph of Mammon. He looked on his calling as entirely enough to fill full the life that would fulfill the calling. It was ambition enough for him to be the head of his family, with the highest of earthly relations to realize toward its members. As to the vulgar notion of a man's obligation to himself, he had learned to despise it. "Rubbish!" Ian would say. "I owe myself nothing. What has myself ever done for me, but lead me wrong? What but it has come between me and my duty, between me and my very Father in heaven, between me and my fellow man? The fools of greed would persuade that a man has no right to waste himself in the low content of making and sharing a humble living. He ought to make money, make a figure in the world, forsooth, be somebody. Dwell among the people, such would say. Bah! Let them look after themselves. If they cannot pay their rents, others will. What is it to you if the rents are paid? Send them about their business. Turn the land into a deer forest or a sheep farm, and clear them out. They have no rights. A man is bound to the children of his body begotten. The people are nothing to him. A man is not his brother's keeper, except when he has got him in prison, and so on, in the name of the great devil." Whether there was enough in Alister to have met and overcome the spirit of the world, had he been brought up at Oxford or Cambridge, I have not to determine. There was that in him, at least, which would have come to repent bitterly had he yielded. But, brought up as he was not only able to entertain the exalted idea presented to him, but to receive and make it his. With joy he recognized the higher dignity of the shepherd of a few poor, lean, wool-torn human sheep than of the man who stands for himself, however spacious in the possession of dirt. He who holds dead land a possession, and living souls none of his, needs wake no curse, for he is in the very pit of creation, a living outrage on the human family. If Alister Macruadh was not in the highest grade of Christianity, he was on his way thither, for he was doing the work that was given him to do, which is the first condition of all advancement. He had much to learn yet, but he was one who, from every point his feet touched, was on the start to go further. The day of the Holy Eve rose clear and bright. Snow was on the hills and frost in the valley. There had been a time when at this season great games were played between neighbour districts or clans, but here there were no games now, because there were so few men. The more active part fell to the women. Mistress Macruadh was busy all day with her helpers preparing a dinner of mutton and beef and fowls and red deer ham, and the men soon gave the barn something of the aspect of the old patriarchal hall, for which it was no very poor substitute. A long table, covered with the finest linen, was laid for all comers, and when the guests took their places they needed no arranging. All knew their standing, and seated themselves according to knowledge. 2 or 3 small farmers took modestly the upper places once occupied by immediate relatives of the chief, for of the old gentry of the clan there were none. But all were happy, for their chief was with them still. Their reverence was none the less that they were at home with him. They knew his worth, and the roughest among them would mind what the Macruadh said. They knew that he feared nothing, that he was strong as the red stag after which the clan was named, that, with genuine respect for every man, he would at the least insolence knock the fellow down, that he was the best shot, the best sailor, the best ploughman in the clan. I would have said the best swordsman, but that, except Ian, there was not another left to it. Not many of them, however, understood how much he believed that he had to give an account of his people. He was far from considering such responsibility the clergyman's only. Again and again had he expostulated with some to save them from the slow gaping hell of drink, and in one case, he had reason to hope, with success. As they sat at dinner, it seemed to the young fellow, who, with his help, had so far been victorious, that the chief scarcely took his eyes off him. One might think there was small danger where the hostess allowed nothing beyond water and milk but small ale. The chief, however, was in dread lest he should taste even that, and caught one moment the longing look he threw at the jug as it passed. He rose and went down the table, speaking to this one and that, but stopped behind the lad, and, putting his arm around his shoulders, whispered in his ear. The youth looked up in his face with a solemn smile. Had not the chief embraced him before them all? He was only a shepherd lad, but his chief cared for him. In the afternoon the extemporized tables were cleared away. Candles were fixed in rough sconces along the walls, not without precaution against fire, and the floor was rubbed clean, for the barn was floored throughout with pine, in parts polished with use. The walls were already covered with the plaids of the men and women, each kept in place by a stone or two on the top of the wall where the rafters rested. In one end was a great heap of yellow oat straw, which, partly levelled, made a most delightful divan. What with the straw, the plaids, the dresses, the shining of silver ornaments, and the flash of here and there a cairngorm or an amethyst, there was not a little colour in the barn. Some of the guests were poorly, but all were decently attired, and the shabbiest behaved as ladies and gentlemen. The party from the new house walked through the still, star-watched air, with the motionless mountains looking down on them, and a silence around which they never suspected as a presence. The little girls were of the company, and there was much merriment. Foolish compliments were not wanting, offered chiefly on the part of Mr. Sercombe, and accepted on that of Christina. The ladies, under their furs and hoods, were in their best, with all the jewels they could wear at once, for they had heard that Highlanders have a passion for colour, and that poor people are always best pleased when you go to them in your finery. The souls of these Sassenachs were full of things. They made a fine show as they emerged from the darkness of their wraps into the light of the numerous candles, nor did the approach of the widowed chieftainess to receive them on the arm of Alister, with Ian on her other side, fail in dignity. The mother was dressed in a rich matronly black silk, the chief was in the full dress of his clan, the old-fashioned coat of the French court, with its silver buttons and ruffles of fine lace, the kilt of Macruadh tartan, in which red predominated, the silver-mounted sporran, of the skin and adorned like the head of an otter caught with the bare hands of one of his people, and a silver-mounted dirk of length unusual, famed for the beauty of both hilt and blade. Ian was similarly, though less showily, clad. When she saw the stately dame advancing between her sons, one at least of her visitors felt a doubt whether their condescension would be fully appreciated. As soon as their reception was over, the piper, to the discomfort of Mr. Sercombe's English ears, began his invitation to the dance, and in a few moments the floor was in a tumult of reels. The girls, unacquainted with their own country's dances, preferred looking on, and after watching reel and Strapsby for some time, altogether declined attempting either. But by and by it was the turn of the clanspeople to look on, while the lady of the house and her sons danced a quadrille or two with their visitors. After which the chief and his brother, pairing with the two elder girls, the ladies were astonished to find them the best they had ever waltzed with, although they did not dance quite in the London way. Ian's dancing, Christina said, was French. Mercy said all she knew was that the chief took the work and left her only the motion. She felt as in a dream of flying. Before the evening was over, the young men had so far gained on Christina that Mr. Sercombe looked a little commonplace. End of number 5. Number 6 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 6... Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, by Patrick McGill. Chapter 6. Christmas Eve. The sergeant's water bottle's full, but it is strange to see the sergeant on the earhole for some water for his tea. But ain't it strange when night is on and we are out of sight, the sergeant takes his bottle out and swigs from it all night. Cold water, cold water, cold old water. From The Lost Rum Ration. It was about 7 o'clock in the evening, and an unusual silence brooded over the loose salient. In the trenches the silence always broods. The soldiers, not knowing what the moment may bring forth, are uneasy, and the eternal hidden menace of the unknown is intensified by the stillness. The evening was intensely dark. Black, impenetrable shadows bulked in the trenches, and became the colour of the parapet, parados, and bay. Objects quite near at hand took on strange, fantastic shapes, and looked like men lying asleep on the fire-steps. Only a closer examination would show that the phantoms were sandbags or ammunition boxes. Many of the boys were smoking. The lighted cigarettes glowed like rubies set in an illimitable spread of ebony. It was raining. A soft, almost caressing rain dropped sleekly and helplessly down on the firing line. In this manner it had been falling for hours. The trenches were filled to the fire-step with slush and muck. The duck-boards were afloat, and men changing their position in the trench clambered out over the top and walked along the reverse slope of the parapet. Now and again a wayfarer stuck in the clinging quicksand of the trench floor, only to free himself when he succeeded in climbing out of his Wellington boots. Fitzgerald sat down on the fire-step and sank into the soft mud. So complete was the stillness that he could distinctly hear all the varied sounds of the night mingling together in a long-drawn, slumberous murmur. the far-off death lullaby of a heavy shell, the soft quivering croon of the damp wind, the sough of a boot as a soldier walked along the trench, the vague murmurings from a near dug-out, the enervating sizzle of falling rain, and the varied, indefinable night movements of nature blended sleepily together in a slumber that made for nightmares and fevered dreams. Fitzgerald dozed off, only to wake in an instant by hearing voices speaking very close to him. "Spudhole, my rifle is full of dirt. Half a sandbag of chalk has gone down the barrel," said the voice of Bowdy Benners. "Mine is full up of muck, too," said Spudhole. There was an indifference in his tones. He seemed to have lost all interest in his best friend, his "ipe." "I don't care a damn," he muttered. "An ipe's only made to be cleaned in this here war, as far as I can see." "When is the rum coming up?" Bowdy inquired. "Probably we'll get none to night." "Sup," said Bub, "round the next bay in the dug out." "Well, I'm off," said Bowdy. "I'm half frozen. I'm for a good tot if it's going. By the way," he asked, as if it had suddenly occurred to him, "how many of our fellows were blown up by the mine this morning?" "7 or 8," said Bub, "or maybe more." "And to think that to night's Christmas Eve," said Benners, as if the conversation had forcibly reminded him of the fact. The two men clambered over the top and made their way towards the dug out from which the rum was issued. Fitzgerald got up and followed. As he crawled over the sandbags, a star shell rose into the darkness and lit the scene of war. The country showed wet and livid, the barbed wire entanglements wound crookedly along the levels, the wires stretched out, waiting for their prey with threatening barbs. In the brooding silence and the locality of war, hate and vengeance persisted and were well in keeping with the ominous night, and here it seemed they found their most direct expression. Fitzgerald looked round, and queer, fragmentary thoughts rioted in his head. He remembered a verse of a song which he had once heard, and repeated it aloud. "Here comes I, Jack Straw, such a man you never saw. Through a rock, through a reel, through an old spinning wheel, through a mill hopper, through a bag of pepper, sheep's shanks, chicken bone, give me a kiss or leave me alone." "What has put this nonsense into my mind?" he asked himself. "Probably it is because it is part of a Christmas carol. And this is Christmas Eve. 2,000 years gone by, and the message of the Prince of Peace not made manifest yet. Well, I wonder if the rum is waiting." He made his way into the trench again, and came in sight of the dug out, with its candle lit in a niche of the chalky wall, and its huddled occupants lying on the floor. A few, no doubt, were asleep. 2 or 3 were sitting, their backs against the chalk, their heads bent down almost between their knees. All were dressed in sheepskin coats, khaki trousers, and high boots, and wore full equipment, their cartridge pouches being well stocked with ammunition. Although a bank of earth was heaped up on the doorstep, it did not prevent the water from dripping inside. The floor of the dug out was as mucky as the floor of the trench. Stooping down, Fitzgerald crawled in through the narrow door of the shelter. Bub was already inside, scraping the muck from his boots with a clasp knife. Behind him, with his back against the wall, sat Bowdy Benners, cutting a lump of cheese into small portions. The cheese was a big item of the Christmas Eve rations. He was sitting down now, his head thrust forward, his big hands busy with the cheese. As Fitzgerald entered, he looked up, then glanced round the dug out. "Not much grub to night, boys," he said. 4 biscuits, a half tin of bully, and a piece of cheese for each man." "And the rum?" asked Bub, forestalling every man with the question. "It's here, all right," said Bowdy. They stared open-mouthed for a full second, then a roar of delight echoed through the dug out, and the sleepers awoke. Bub rose to his feet, whirled his clasp knife round his hand, endeavoured to dance a jig, and only stopped when his head came in forcible contact with the roof for the 3rd time. Fitzgerald chuckled. A glow of satisfaction lit up his handsome face, and his eyes rested lovingly on the sandbag which stood in an angle of the wall near the door. Then he lay back, rested his head on the wall, and stared at the candle. In that position he looked a very charming boy, and he knew it. In civil life he must have been very fond of society, the company of notable people, and above all of pretty women. Again he looked at the sandbag in the angle of the wall, but his eyes were not the only ones fixed on that object, and no wonder. The sandbag contained the rum jar. "Well, what about a tot?" asked Bub. Bowdy rose and took the sandbag into the middle of the room, where he uncovered the precious jar and filled a mess tin of liquor. He handed the tin to Bub. "Cheero!" said the Cockney, and drank. He passed the tin round and wiped his lips. "There's some guts in rum," he muttered, and his voice was full of emotion. "Gawd, it doesn't half warm up the inside of a bloke. Now what about a Christmas dinner?" he continued. "Bully ain't what one would call très bon, is it? Christmas dinner of bully beef. Gor blimey, that's no blurry good." "It's a funny thing that a full belly always is associated with happiness," said Fitzgerald, shaking his head and laughing loudly. Rum went easily to his head. "If a man gets married, he feeds well, and if a child is born to him, he stuffs himself with viands. It's always his belly." "Always," said Bub, reaching a second time for the mess tin. "It doesn't matter what Fitz says," remarked Bowdy Benners, sinking his chin into the collar of his sheepskin coat. "What I say is this: we must have a Christmas dinner to morrow." "How can we get one?" Fitz inquired. "Easy enough that," said Bowdy. "I know an old woman of the Café Calomphie. A parcel of good things could be got there for a few francs. I could go down to Les Brebis in an hour." "But they're shelling the road," Fitzgerald remarked, "blowing holes in it, and the houses are flying about the streets. Not only that, but you're not supposed to go away from here. And again, all shops are closed at 9 o'clock. It's well past 8 now." "But that doesn't matter," said Bowdy. "The woman of the café is a great friend of mine." "You're a sly old dog, Bowdy," said Bub. "No one'd think that to look at yer." Bowdy went red in the face, and proceeded to buckle his equipment, his hands trembling a little over the job. "We'll have a collection, anyhow," said Fitzgerald, and he flung a coin into his mess tin. Several coins followed, and in the end the magnificent sum of 12 francs 50 was collected. Bowdy put the money in his pocket, took a last long-drawn pull at his cigarette, and went out. "I'll be back again in no time," were his final words. The men turned their attention to the rum jar again. Tongues were loosened, and stories of past Christmases went round the dug-out. Bub, strong on the traditions of the regiment, told the story of the brigadier's kit inspection at St. Albans the Christmas previous. "The old brig come round when he was inspecting us, and he looked at my pack," said Bub. "That's the neatest pack I've seed in the whole battalion," says the brig. "'Ave you got everything that's laid down in orders in that 'ere pack?' he says to me. 'Everything,' I says. 'I know that the contents of a nice pack is always nice and clean,' he says. 'I'll just have a look in your pack. Take it off, and take out everything, and lay 'em out,' he says. Gor blimey! I did what he'd ordered me, and my bloomin' pack was full of straw. 'Twas lighter to carry than the ordinary caboose. 14 days' spud hole," Bub concluded. Fitzgerald was singing a song, and waving an empty mess tin over his head. The song was one of his own making, a Rabelaisian production, with a snappy chorus. All joined in, and drank in turn. Suddenly they heard the dull rumble of approaching shells, and the loud explosions of the missiles in the fields outside. Fitzgerald lit a cigarette, and finished a chorus. "They're strafing again," he said. "The damned pastime will never come to an end." Chapter 7 Christmas Day. Blurry well freezin' and cold as sin, Christmas Day in the mornin', the big guns welcomed the Saviour in, Christmas Day in the mornin'. Used to have fingers and used to have toes, used to have ears as well as a nose, but now I don't think that I've got any of those, Christmas Day in the mornin'. Wish we was safe in a stall today, Christmas Day in the mornin', watchin' the cattle munchin' their hay, Christmas Day in the mornin'. The Prince of Peace was born, we're told, snug in a stall in the days of old. Lord, look down on us 'ere in the cold, on Christmas Day in the mornin'. From Carols of Good Will. The dawn was at hand, the dawn of Christmas Day. Fitzgerald was standing on the fire-step, looking over No Man's Land towards the enemy's trenches. It was his hour on sentry go. The rain was still falling, and his hands and feet felt very cold, but he was powerless to restore any warmth to his body by moving about. To leave the fire-step for a moment was dangerous. He knew that if he stuck in the mud of the trench he could not extricate himself, for he felt utterly worn out. He had been warm enough when he went on watch owing to the rum which he had drunk, but now he was shivering as if his whole being had been stricken with ague. He tried to warm his legs by striking one against the other, but his feet felt so heavy that he desisted after 2 or 3 ineffectual endeavours to release them from the mud. The slightest movement was a monstrous futility, and now that it had become so difficult to move, he did not want to remain still, and he had the greatest desire in the world to be free-footed and doing something. The Germans were shelling the sector on the right, and the chill, wet morning was lit up by the lurid flashes of bursting explosives. The air was full of the rumbling and crashing of the conflict. Shells sped across the trench, careering towards some distant objective, probably the village, where old Bowdy was routing out the essentials for a Christmas dinner. And Bowdy had not returned yet. Some 9 hours had gone by since he departed on his mission. "Probably he has got blown to pieces," Fitzgerald muttered. "Poor old Bowdy." Then he passed, without further thought of Bowdy, to memories which came into his head at random. He thought of his home, away up in the little glen in Galway, of the neighbours there, of Dolty Fadden, the great gambler, who always won when he turned his coat outside in, of Eamon Hudag, who got drunk at Glenagh Fair and lost his clothes somewhere at night. In the morning he came across the hills in a red flannel petticoat, of Paddy Brogan, who cleared out the same fair with a stone in the foot of a woman's stocking. "I wish I was in Glenagh now," Fitzgerald said. "A good turf fire, a bit and a sup, and the neighbours coming in for the night's raking." Then all these memories and desires floated together and jumbled themselves up in his head, and he fell asleep. He was awakened by a feeling that everything was not as it should be. For the unusual there was only one place to look, out on his front, and his eyes were already fixed on the grey, formless level which lay between his trench and the enemy's. Nothing changed there, everything just... Then Fitzgerald saw a huge bulk take shape on his right front, 20 yards from the trench and 50 yards away from the spot where he stood. The bulk rose upright, like a gigantic monster of some pre-Adamite age, paused for a second as if considering something, then it burst in twain, and Fitzgerald flopped down into the mucky trench, half blinded and deafened by the flash and thunder of the exploding mine. The earth had vomited its entrails out, a million rocks rioted through the air and ricocheted off the parapet. The dawn was thick with flying rubbish, the greater part of which seemed to be falling into the trench, dropping with a sickly splosh into the muck. The world was falling down around the ears of the Irishman. "Out and man the mine crater!" The order came along the trench like a half-strangled whisper. Fitzgerald rose from the muck and spluttered the message along to the next bay, then gripped his rifle and clambered up and across the parapet. Most of the men were already out and rushing towards the crater of the mine. Fitzgerald had a vivid impression of flying figures in sheepskin coats, of rifles in the air, of bursting shells, of men stumbling, falling, and rising, of hoarse-voiced oaths and imprecations, of queries and answers. "Not our mine, is it? I thought we were too far apart. Are we to get into the blurry hole before the gas clears away?" were a few of the remarks which came to his ears. A corporal halted near him and shouted something about the risk the men were running. "We'll be poisoned by the fumes in the crater," he said. "We're coming across too soon. Far too soon," he muttered. "Far too blurry soon." But no one paid any heed. To stop on the open was dangerous, and the Germans were out already. They could be seen, dark figures breaking through the enemy's barbed wire entanglements. Presently they would be engaged with the British in a hand-to-hand encounter for the possession of the crater. Fitzgerald reached the rim of the hole and stood there for a moment looking down. Heavy coils of thick smoke wound snake-like along the bottom, where the black earth was illumined by ghastly phosphorescent lights that trailed up the sides in thin, sluggish streaks. A few soldiers were already going down into the place, and halting from time to time, taking stock of the scene before them. All were spluttering and coughing, and a few had pulled their gas helmets down over their heads and faces. "This is no blurry beanfest, I can tell yer," Spudhole muttered, as he tried to clamber back, crawling with difficulty almost knee-deep in the rubble. As he moved, the clay shot away from beneath him, and he found himself in the unenviable plight of being able to advance a foot only to find himself slipping back a yard. The enemy shelled with unceasing persistency, and men were getting struck on the rim of the crater. Anywhere was better than where they were standing. They flopped into the crater, making futile efforts to save themselves from rolling to the bottom by clawing at the clay of the sides. Once down, however, they found to their relief that breathing was easier than they had anticipated. "What now?" someone inquired, looking vaguely round. "What indeed? What's to be done?" "We'll get killed like blurry rats down 'ere. The Allimongs are coming over in droves. It's better to fight 'em on the top than to let 'em stone us to death down 'ere." Sergeant Snogger, in a sheepskin coat, which was freshly ripped across the shoulder by a bullet or shell splinter, rolled down the side of the crater and landed at the bottom. In a moment he was on his feet. "Up to the top, boys!" he cried. "Don't stand here arguing like fishwives. Up to the top, or you'll be damned unlucky." Immediately the men were crawling up like ants, but with extreme difficulty. Their heavy boots, their equipments and rifles impeded their movements. Each man was a khaki-clad Sisyphus, battling against an incline such as the patient Sisyphus never experienced. The men, grunting and swearing, seemed to be making no headway. The scaling of the crater side, about 60 feet in depth, was a Herculean task for men strong of wind and limb. To them it was a task of despair. "We'll never get there," Bub grunted. Then his eyes sought the top. "Gor blimey!" he muttered. "There they come!" A man dressed in German uniform stood on the rim of the crater, a rifle in his hand, and looked down. As the soldiers watched, he raised his rifle to his shoulder and pointed it at the crush in the bottom of the crater. The movement was his last. Bowdy Benners arrived at that moment, dressed in full marching order, his rifle in his hand and the bayonet fixed. The point was delivered at the shoulder, and Benner's long arms put all the zest of a strong body into the movement. The German came clean over the rim of the crater and rolled down to the bottom, clawing at the air with frenzied fingers. Bowdy lay down at the top and his rifle became active. Round after round sped across the open towards the foe, who were now coming up in bulk and getting very close to the crater. "Keep it up, Bowdy!" cried Snogger. "Are they near?" "They're not far away," said Bowdy, without looking round. "Devil blow me blind, they'll be here in a second if you don't come up and give me a hand. Ah, they've stopped now, a shell has caught a couple." "All right, Bowdy, we're here," the sergeant shouted, reaching the summit. The main body of Germans, advancing in open order, was still some 50 yards away. As far as could be ascertained at the moment, the delay they should have been across the open 3 minutes ago was due to a heavy curtain fire which had greeted them just as they came out of their trenches. The fire caught them at the barbed wire entanglements, concussion shells tore up the wires and swept them around the bodies of the attackers, and the impartial shrapnel rained viciously down on the huddled heaps of wounded. The quick were advancing, a dispirited party of men, in open order, glad to get away from their own trenches, which were suffering cruel chastisement. Some were willing to fight even yet. 5 or 6 had flung themselves down on the ground and trained their rifles on the British positions, opening a wild, erratic fire of slight intensity. Cold hands never hold a rifle steady on a Christmas morning. The men in the crater lay down behind the parapet which the exploding mine had formed, and opened fire with deadly effect. "That'll knock the blurry stuffin' out of 'em," Spudhole remarked. "There they come now, their 'ands up in the air." It was even as he remarked. The advanced line of Germans put their timorous hands over their heads and stepped diffidently towards the mine. "Kamerad! Kamerad!" they whined, their arms shaking as if stricken with palsy. The snipers threw their rifles away and joined in with their mates. All were sick of the job. "Take them prisoners," said Sergeant Snogger. "There's nothing else to be done." An hour later, when the wounded had been carried back to the trench and the prisoners were marched off to the village at the rear, the victors were left to themselves in undisputed possession of their hard-won crater. The Christmas morning scene was one never to be forgotten. The rain-swept crater, the crumbling clay, the fumes of gunpowder, the dead bodies, the monotonous hum of ragtime choruses, the shells bursting across the top, the dirty rifles and the dirtier men who endeavoured to clean them. Bowdy Benners was there with a full pack and a bulging haversack. Fitzgerald and Spudhole were deep in a discussion on some nonsensical subject, but the discussion served its object. It brought the men's minds away from the stark reality of their surroundings. Snogger, sitting on his haunches, was giving details of the fight to his platoon commander, Captain Thorley. Bub drew up towards Bowdy and asked him for a drink from his water bottle. Benners handed it to him with a solemn look. Spudhole drank. "Good?" asked Bowdy. "Wonderful stuff," said Spudhole. "Hand it round," said Bowdy. All drank from the water bottle in turn, and each man winked knowingly when he drank. None of the men had expected any rum that morning, the ration of the night before had been so short. The limbers met with a mishap when coming up to the Vallée Dump. Of course, all were aware that Bowdy had come into possession of the rum by illegitimate means. However, no inquiries were made. "Now, what about a smoke before dinner?" Bub remarked, fixing a knowing glance on Bowdy. "'As anybody got a fag to spare? Many a pore bloke has gone west since I had my last fag." Fitzgerald fumbled about in his haversack and found a box, a little tin box, lying snug and dry amidst a crush of papers and broken biscuits. Some 50 cigarettes were enclosed within. He handed them around. They lit them up. The drink and the smoke exercised a cheering effect upon the men. A look of pleasure stole over every face, and the men burst into uncontrollable fits of laughter when Spudhole, standing on a platform of clay, placed his arms akimbo and wished all a Merry Christmas. "If we have to spend the day here, we must spend it here, we must stick it here, and there's no more to be said," he laughed. "We'll get relieved to night," he added. "That's if we're lucky." "Suppose we build a dug out and light a fire," said Snogger. "There's 6 poles standing over the top. We've got waterproof sheets, trenching tools, and good chalk to work in." Drawing their tools from their equipment, the men set to labour with zeal, hollowed out a shelter in the chalk, roofed it over, and lit a fire. The latter was the most difficult feat, and several entrenching tool handles had to be cut into thin spales and placed over the flames before the fire burned properly. "Devil blow me blind if that's not very clever," said Bowdy Benners, when the flames were dancing merrily against the wall of the dug out. "It almost puts me in mind of Christmas away in Blighty. Now we'll see what we've got in hand for a meal for our Christmas dinner. I'll look in my pack." He opened his pack and took out the treasures, which he piled against the wall of the dug out. The pack contained 3 large loaves, cut into thick chunks, 8 tins of sardines, a tin of condensed café au lait, 2 bottles of champagne, and several slabs of Meunier's chocolate. The bulging haversack was another treasure wallet. It contained apples and pastry in abundance, also a tin of lard, which would presently be used for frying bully beef. During all the morning the artillery fire had not wholly slackened, but now a quiet moment held the line. Dinner was prepared. First the men made tea, using the water from their water bottles, boiling it in mess tins over the fire. Then they cooked their bully beef on the mess tin lids, and cut the bread into nice thin slices. It was Fitzgerald who proposed that all slices should be thin, and none gainsayed his whim. The first course consisted of sardines and bread, the second course of bread and fried bully. Tea was served with every course. Followed pastry for dessert, and fruit was served out in dainty portions. They brought the meal to an end by drinking French wine and English rum, and lighting up their cigarettes. During the meal the platoon commander was deep in talk with Sergeant Snogger, and when the Christmas dinner was over he came forward and spoke to the party. "My boys," he said, "this, I suppose, is the most interesting Christmas you've ever spent." Bub: "Too interesting for me, sir." Platoon commander: "Yes, I suppose it is. But I hope that neither you nor any of us will spend Christmas under such conditions again. Such things must be at times, I suppose, and seeing that it came to our turn, I must admit that we did as well as any platoon in the British Army. You stuck to your posts like bricks, and reaped honours from a fight where the odds were very much against us. Rifle Benners, at a critical moment, showed great resource in putting one of the enemy out of action. For this we must thank him." Platoon: "Hear, hear! Good old Bowdy," etc. Platoon commander: "I haven't much further to say, except that I'm going to recommend Rifleman Benners for the D.C.M. I am not going to make any inquiries as to where he spent last night and the early hours of this morning. As all of you men assert that he was in the trenches, I'll take your word for it. I'm not going to inquire where the champagne, bread, and other things came from, but if I may, I'll say that I've never in all my life enjoyed a meal half as well as I enjoyed my Christmas dinner in the Loos Salient." That night the Irish were relieved. A month later the D.C.M. was given to Bowdy Benners. End of number 6. Number 7 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 7, Ted's Double, A Christmas Folly, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. When Morris Stanley came east, and Ted Stanley met him at the gate, both boys looked at each other for a moment in a somewhat bewildered way. "If you're not me myself, you must be my cousin Morris from the wild and woolly West," said Ted, with a hearty handshake. "Welcome to Chestnut Hill, old fellow." "When I first got a glimpse of you," said Morris, with a smile, "I thought I'd come on ahead of myself and got here first." In fact, the resemblance between the two boys was wonderful. They were the same in age, height, and general build. Their features were similar, and both had curly reddish hair, clear blue-gray eyes, and a healthy coloring. To be sure, when they were together, a close observer could easily have detected some difference. Morris had a graver, more thoughtful expression than had rollicking Ted, and was quieter in his manner, although as fond of fun and jokes as a boy could be. This was his first visit East, and the first occasion of his meeting with a host of uncles and aunts, cousins and second cousins. Morris had never spent so delightful a vacation. The prairie farm where he had lived all his life was so big a one, and surrounded by so many still bigger ones, that neighbours were few and far away. So Morris revelled in his host of Eastern cousins, and the comradeship he had always craved. One day, when he had been at Chestnut Hill about 6 weeks, he found Ted rummaging over a huge pile of books in his den. said den being a corner of the big garret where Ted kept all his household gods and sojourned on rainy days. Both boys were very fond of the den. It was such a jolly old place, as untidy as they pleased, where nobody ever disturbed them or their traps, up under the eaves, with one small window looking out over the uplands of Chestnut Hill. But this particular day was a sunny one, and the sight of unstudious Fred up to his ears in books in the middle of vacation was one for which Morris was unprepared. "Has anything serious happened?" he queried solemnly. "You'd think so to look at me, wouldn't you?" grinned Ted. "Well, something serious has happened, to be sure, but it has nothing to do with my present uncanny fit of bookishness. It simply occurred to me that the space taken up in this corner by all these books—whew, aren't they dusty? Shades of Mary Jane!—would be much better filled by my collection of birds' eggs. So I am patiently weeding them out. All that I shall need for college in the fall must be left, and the rest I shall dump into the rag room." "You're a lucky chap, Ted," said Morris, with a sigh. "Because I'm going to college?" queried Ted, blowing the dust from a venerable Julius Caesar. "Well, it is jolly." "Wish you would come too. Think there's no chance of it?" Morris shook his head. "Not a shadow of it. No use in talking about it, Ted. It only makes me glum." In the brief silence that followed, Ted sorted out some ill-used English classics, and Morris ruminated gloomily. To go to college was his greatest desire, but he knew it could not be granted. The crops had failed for 3 years on the prairie farm. Morris knew that when he went home in the fall he was to take a position as clerk in one of the big department stores in the nearest city, and he hated the prospect sturdily, even while he congratulated himself on being able to get it, and so lighten his father's burden somewhat. "What is the serious thing that has happened?" he asked at last, recalling that part of Ted's speech. "I've had a letter from Great Aunt Deborah, inviting me to tea with her at her residence in Rexford on Christmas Day." "I don't see anything dreadful in that." "Enviable blindness! You don't know Great Aunt Deborah. I'd rather be invited to sup with the King of the Cannibal Islands. Besides, Christmas morning is the day of the ice hockey game at Moorland, and I've been looking forward to it for weeks." "Well, don't go to your Great Aunt Deborah's, then," suggested Morris. "My son, you do not appear to realize that Great Aunt Deborah's invitations are like unto royalties. They are commands, and must be obeyed under penalty of her eternal displeasure. But don't say 'your Great Aunt Deborah' in a tone which implies that I have a monopoly in great aunts. She is your great aunt as well as mine. Mistress Deborah Stanley is." "How is it that I've never seen her, then?" said Morris. "I thought I had met all my relatives to the 3rd and 4th generations of late." "There is a bit of family history involved in the answer to that. Great Aunt Deborah knows you are here, but she doesn't like you because you are the son of your father. Did you ever hear Uncle Chester speak of his Aunt Deborah?" "Not that I remember." "Well, when your father and mine were boys, your father was Great Aunt Deborah's favourite nephew. She was always very eccentric, father says, but Uncle Chester got along with her beautifully. She intended to make him her heir. She's worth a pot of money, you know. Well, when your father married, it made her very angry. She wanted him to marry some one else, the daughter of the man she had once expected to marry herself, I believe. They had a bitter quarrel, and it ended in Great Aunt Deborah forbidding your father ever to speak to her or cross her threshold again. He took her at her word, father says that is really what she has never forgiven him for, and went out West. She had never allowed his name to be spoken in her hearing since. Very vindictive lady, our Great Aunt Deborah. She's always been rather fond of me. Father says it is because I'm so like what your father was. When we met, she used to pat me on the head and give me peppermints. I haven't seen her for 2 years. She'll think I've grown a bit. Christmas happens to be her birthday, too. I shall have to go, of course. Father insists on it. And I shall miss the hockey game." Ted fired a harmless Virgil across the den and scowled. At the same moment he saw himself and Morris reflected in the long, cracked mirror which hung at the other end of the garret. "Christopher Columbus!" he said. "Morris Stanley, hearken unto me, and lend me your ears. If you have a proper cousinly regard for me, I shall be able to eat my cake and have it too. I shall go to the game at Moorland, and you shall go to tea with Great Aunt Deborah at Rexford." "But she hasn't invited me, and doesn't want me," objected Morris. "Morris, my friend, you are singularly lacking in quickness of comprehension. You will go, not as Morris Stanley, but as Theodore Stanley, to wit, myself. Great Aunt Deborah shall never know the difference. No more will anybody else. I always knew we didn't look so much alike for nothing." Morris stared, and then went off in a shout of laughter. "But, Ted, I really can't do that. I'd be discovered, and besides—" "No, you wouldn't. Now, don't refuse to help a fellow out, Morris. I'd do as much for you. You don't care about the game, and I do, and no harm can be done." At first Morris protested, but Ted eagerly overruled all his objections, and in the end he consented. The spice of mischief in the plan commended it to him. Besides, he was conscious of a curiosity to see Great Aunt Deborah. "I'll go," he said, "but if Great Aunt Deborah discovers that I am a rank impostor, and takes some fearful and summary vengeance, I trust you to break the news gently to my parents." On Saturday afternoon Morris and Ted both set off. At the cross roads they parted, and Ted trudged down the hills to Moorland, while Morris steadily footed his way to Rexford. He did not feel altogether comfortable, but it was too late to back out now. Miss Deborah Stanley lived in an old-fashioned but picturesque house on the outskirts of Rexford. Morris admired the beautiful grounds as he walked up the serpentine drive under the chestnuts. He felt rather nervous, but his love of mischief bubbled up within him and primed him for the ordeal. It also lent an added sparkle to his eyes as he went up the steps. Great Aunt Deborah met him at the door. "I am glad to see you, Theodore," she said, with a kindly handshake. "And I am glad to see you, Aunt Deborah," said Morris, sincerely enough, "and to wish you many happy returns of the day." The appearance of his great aunt was a surprise to Morris, who had somehow imbibed from Ted an impression very different from the reality. True, she had, as Ted had warned him, eyes like a hawk, so keen and piercing that Morris trembled for the success of his ruse; but they were dark, handsome eyes as well. She was richly dressed, and had a great deal of snow-white hair arranged in puffs so carefully as to betoken that Great Aunt Deborah had a pet vanity yet. Altogether, Morris liked her looks, as he would have said. He was taken into a big, gloomy room full of quaint old furniture, and here they talked for an hour. Morris talked well, even under the handicap of talking as if he were Ted. He was not free from an unpleasant dread that he would inadvertently say something that would give him away, and several of Great Aunt Deborah's questions were rather hard to answer. As he told Ted afterwards, "I had to take some liberties with your imagination." But on the whole he got on very cleverly, although he felt the reverse of comfortable. If only Great Aunt Deborah were not so kind! If she had been cranky and crotchety, as he had expected, the joke would have had a much better flavour. His bad quarter of an hour came after tea, when Great Aunt Deborah said abruptly, "You have a cousin staying with you, I hear, Chester Stanley's son. What sort of a boy is he?" Morris blushed so hotly that he felt thankful to the gloom. He's a rather jolly chap," he answered, confused. "A good deal like me, they say." "You are very like what his father was at your age," said Great Aunt Deborah, half sharply, half tenderly. "He was my favourite nephew until he disobeyed me. Well, Theodore, I am glad to have seen you this afternoon. You have improved a great deal. As for this cousin of yours, what does he intend to make of himself? Is he clever? Does he intend to go to college?" I can hardly say," stammered Morris. "No, I don't think he's going to college. He would like to, but well, I don't think he is going." "Can't afford it, I suppose? Chester Stanley is poor," said Great Aunt Deborah, with a certain jarring note of satisfaction in her voice. "But this is not to my purpose. It is of yourself I wish to speak, Theodore. I have something to give you." She went to an old oak desk in the corner and took out two cases, one brand new, the other somewhat old-fashioned. Sitting down by Morris, she said, "I am going to give you this in remembrance of your visit and my birthday. It is very good of you to give up your other plans and spend the afternoon with me. After this you must come oftener. Here is your present, Theodore." It was a beautiful gold watch, with Ted's monogram on the back. Morris took it foolishly. If floors ever did open to swallow up boys, he wished the one he was on would do so then. "Thank you, Aunt Deborah," he stammered. But Great Aunt Deborah did not notice his embarrassment. She was fumbling with the stiff catch of the other case, which, on being opened, revealed another watch of very elaborate, although old-fashioned design and ornamentation. "This watch," she said, "I had made 20 years ago for your Uncle Chester. When he disregarded my wishes, I did not give it to him. It is as good as ever, for all practical purposes. Take it to your cousin, Morris Stanley, with his Great Aunt Deborah's love." She held it out to Morris, but instead of taking it, he stood up suddenly with a very grave, determined face. "I can't take that watch, Aunt Deborah," he said quietly. "I'm not Ted. I am Morris. Ted wanted to go to the game at Moorland today, so I agreed to come here in his place. I thought it a good joke at the time. I see now that it was a dishonourable trick. I am very sorry for it, Aunt Deborah." "And so you ought to be." Aunt Deborah spoke sharply. At first she had looked amazed, then angry; but now her keen old eyes were twinkling. "I suppose you thought it was smart to play a trick on an old woman." "Oh, no," said Morris quickly. "I never thought of it in that way, although I did think it a joke. Please forgive me, and don't blame Ted. It was mostly my fault." "You and Ted are a pair of graceless scamps," said Aunt Deborah severely. "I ought to be very angry with you both. I feel sure Ted put you up to this, but I shall have to forgive you both, I suppose. And you are Chester Stanley's son. You look like him. Well, go home. Take your watches and be off. Tell Ted he is to come here next Saturday afternoon and get his scolding. As for you, well, if you care to come back any time, I will be glad to see you, Morris. I am an old crank, but even cranks can be amiable at times. Now go." Morris went. He felt rather bewildered. When he got home, he told Ted the whole story. "Jerusalem!" said the latter. "Won't Great Aunt Deborah give me a combing down when she sees me! I suppose I deserve it. She treated you pretty white, anyhow. And those watches are dandies. It is the most astonishing thing that she wasn't furious at you when you blurted out that confession. Are you going to see her again?" "Of course I am. I like Great Aunt Deborah," said Morris. He did go. Not once only, but often. There was no denying that somehow or other Morris had found his way to Great Aunt Deborah's heart. And when he went back West, the departmental clerkship had vanished forever from his horizon. He was to go to college in the fall. Great Aunt Deborah had said so, and her will was law. "Great Aunt Deborah is a brick," said Ted, when they parted. "I repent in sackcloth and ashes of anything I ever said to the contrary. Good-bye till next month, old chap. Won't we waken the old university up, though!" End of number 7. Number 8 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 8, Christmas at the U.S. Army Hospital, circa 1862. I promised when we parted, dear C., that you should have some account of our Christmas doings, but the busy days have slipped by till now, without my finding a moment to redeem that promise. You know how we are all occupied at that time, but no matter how much there is to be done, in these days private interests have a different signification and demand attention. The morning of Christmas Eve, therefore, found and myself on our way to the hospital. With that ready interest which with her always rises to meet the emergency, even at the busiest moments, she has offered to go with me and help us in our work, and you know how it doubles my pleasure for her to do so. Several of the ladies have agreed to meet here to-day, some for the purpose of superintending the cooking for the Christmas dinner, plum puddings, etc., others to make and put up the greens for the Christmas decoration. We, as you may suppose, are among the latter class. Our quiet ladies' room is quite a scene of bustle this morning, the ladies in charge for the week carrying on, or attempting to carry on, their usual duties, others flying in and out for various purposes, green wreaths strewing the floor, and vain attempts are being made to twist them into some available shape. This confusion will never do. Nothing can be accomplished in this way. Let us go into one of the wards where it is quiet, and soon we find ourselves seated by the stove, endeavoring to form a green sentence by covering the letters with moss and ground pine. They have been nicely cut for us by the genius of the hospital, and we are pressing into our service all the men who can sew, or rather all who say that they can, which is sometimes quite a different affair. But before we begin, we must go and speak to poor James, who has been so ill. He is actually sitting up, but how pale and weak he looks, and what a languid expression as he smiles. He tells us that he hopes to be in the dining-room to-morrow, and in a few days to start for home. Ah, James, that photograph so carefully concealed beneath your pillow peeps out occasionally, and we all know that you left a 2 weeks' bride to serve your country. He has been suffering from fever, but worse than this, he is subject to epileptic fits, which he had hoped were cured. But hard life and exposure have brought them back, and he has had several very severe attacks since he has been here. His gentle, winning manner has made him a general favorite, and we are all glad to see him better. He begs to have his chair moved up to our circle, where he can at least look on while we work. And he is always sure to find plenty of ready and willing hands to do any service that he needs. But our work must not stand still, and lo, at this crisis, we find ourselves without implements. We had supposed we were simply to twine and festoon wreaths, instead of which, or rather in addition, we find the green must be sewed on to those thick bookbinders' board letters. Oh, why were they not pasteboard, and why have we no thimbles? But these are not the first wounds we have received in the service of our country. So, as we have a few needles, never mind, let us do our best, and as our number is increasing, one after another coming up to see the fun, and being at once enlisted in our service, no doubt we shall accomplish the task. The men who are always ready to help us are specially so to-day, when the bright spirit of the season seems to communicate itself to all. Is there not something singularly striking in thus preparing to hail the birth of the Prince of Peace in the midst of an army hospital, where we are surrounded by all the dreadful effects of war? Surely in no other spot, save the field of battle itself, could we as fully appreciate the priceless blessings contained in that title. Those who cannot sew aid us in other ways. One of our lieutenants prefers to collect the little bunches of green and hand them to me to sew on, rather than try his hand at sewing himself. As he is busily engaged at this work, one of the men, in passing, laughingly rallies him on his occupation. "Pretty work for a commissioned officer!" To oblige a lady horseman is never beneath any officer, no matter what his rank. General himself will tell you that. This from me. A word, by the way. Very sure that no matter what assertion I cover by that name, it will be received by him for truth. There is something very beautiful to me in the pride and heartfelt love which the men so often express for their generals. It is this feeling of trust and confidence in their leaders which is one of the most important elements of success, and upon which victory itself often depends. Ah, here comes M. We have been wondering where she could be, and why she did not appear. Her hands full, as usual, and stopping for a Christmas Eve greeting with each man as she comes along. And see who she has brought in her train, men and boys laden with green wreaths. More still? We shall have quite a bower. And look at that great tree. Where can that have come from? And what can she mean it for? It has been given to her, she says, and we may use it exactly as we like best. Therefore suggests that it shall be a Christmas tree for James, who has just announced his intention to hang up his stocking, and she proposes this in its place. We all take it up as an excellent joke, and declare that he shall have it. He seems to enjoy it too, and smiles with that sweet smile which I am sure first won his young wife's heart, though I should be sorry that she saw it now with that weak, languid eye and pallid brow. We must put a little colour into those cheeks before we send him home. Having nothing else to do, this busiest day of the whole year, promises to supply all the needful for dressing the tree when she returns from dinner, says good-bye, and leaves the men all in high spirits. The work goes briskly on. Some of the men have got tired and left us, but most of them are faithful still, especially my friend there, that tall Yankee with his crutches laid at his side. He is a New Hampshire man, and with true Yankee perseverance has never moved since he concluded to try his hand at greening letters, as he calls it. He calculated he could do that as well as anything else, though he had never tried before, and wonderfully has he succeeded. Many a merry laugh rings out, as the different ones hold up the results of their work, to know if we have an idea what that letter is intended for. And truly we often find some difficulty in recognizing them, but trust their position in the sentence may be more suggestive than when they stand alone. It is tough work, and I am almost inclined to agree with one of the men, who, as he puts the last stitch to his work, starts up, exclaiming, "Well, any man that can do that work is fit to go back to his regiment. I've done nothing like it since I left the Peninsula." As we are hurrying on, to meet the constant demands from the dining room, "Can't you give us an E? Isn't that A done?" A quiet little man at my side turns to me and says in an undertone, "No one thinks of the poor fellow who died here this morning," pointing to the bed directly back of the spot where our merry group is gathered. "Died here? To-day? Who? When?" "Just about a couple of hours ago. A man you never saw. Only brought in a few days since." Could it be possible that here, where we had all been so full of mirth and gaiety but a few hours since, on this very spot, on this Christmas Eve too, a soul had passed from earth, from its vigil here, to keep the festival where? None knew, and none can ever know, till the awful day when the secrets of all hearts shall be revealed. There was a special sadness about this death. I found, upon inquiry, that the case had not been considered a serious one; that the man had even spoken of being at home on New Year's Day; that the ladies had brought him a drink that morning, which they had prepared for him, and scarcely half an hour later the ward master, in passing, had been struck by his appearance, went up to him, and found him quite dead. Apparently he had died calmly and without struggle. This seems more probable from the fact that those in the nearest beds even had no idea of it. But there was a loneliness about that passing which I could not forget. Had he felt the dark cloud coming ere he entered into its shadow? Had he longed to speak, to call, and had no power? Had he yearned to send one last message, one parting word of love, to those far-away dear ones? We may not know, and if a tear moistened those bright greens as they lay almost upon the spot where he so late had been, was it not a type of earth, and of the constant mingling of earthly joy and sorrow, from which we may never escape long as we linger here? Sorrow and gladness together go wending, evil and good come in quick interchange. Fair and foul fortune forever are blending, sunshine and cloud have the skies for their range. I have dropped my work, and am dwelling sadly on these thoughts, when I see one or two start up and rush over to James. What is it? They are lifting him from his chair, and placing him upon his bed. Ah, it is one of those terrible fits, and see, 4 men are holding him down. Here comes the doctor. Let us move away all this work, and keep him quiet. Is it our fault? Have we tired him by our noise, and thus brought it on? Oh, no, the doctor is consoling. He does not at all attribute it to us. He has them often, only he must be kept quiet still. And goodbye to all hopes of his Christmas dinner in the dining-room to-morrow. The usual remedies are applied, but it is a severe attack, and leaves him utterly prostrated. We all repair to the dining-room, and here is, indeed, a scene of bustle and confusion. Ladders against the wall, men putting up the half-finished sentences, festooning the green wreaths, hanging the flag in graceful folds so as to dispose its bright colours to the best advantage amidst the greens, hurrying in and out on various errands, and busying themselves about one scarcely can tell what, only all adding to the general confusion and excitement. Can anyone wonder that no sad impression can continue where there is so much to turn the attention and divert the mind? We are conscious ourselves of its influence, and of course men in whom the feeling is not a deep one must be much more open to it. But here is with all her promised parcels for the Christmas tree. How sorry she is to hear of poor James' fit, but we decide that it will be best to make the tree for him, and have it placed at the foot of his bed to-morrow, to atone for the loss of the dinner. Not to-night. The doctor forbids all excitement at present. And now here is the tree. But how shall we plant it? Some suggest one mode, some another, but none take it in hand, till our ever-obliging Corning, ward-master of our first ward, appears. Prompt to do and ready to act, he wastes no time in words, but bears off the tree, and soon returns it with it firmly planted and ready for service. Thank you, Corning. What a satisfaction there is in being so promptly and pleasantly served. And now we have hands enough. Unfolds her treasures, and wondering eyes and busy hands are soon occupied with them, and ere long the tree stretches out its green arms, laden with golden glories of gilt balls, soldiers in every conceivable costume, pocket mirrors, which may yet look upon more warlike scenes than those they now reflect. In fact, decorations of all sorts, suspended by red, white, and blue cords, and glittering gaily in the gaslight. Ah, here is an addition. Thank you, Lawrence. Those bright red apples, which he has just washed and polished, will have quite a fine effect as he is hanging them among the other miscellaneous specimens which this wonderful tree produces. We are all satisfied and delighted with it, but the great drawback is that poor James cannot see it, now that it is done. But Price, his ward-master and faithful nurse, has promised to lift it in, and place it at the foot of his tree, in the morning, and we know that he never neglects a promise. The chaplain is to hold a Christmas Eve service here this evening at 7 o'clock, so we are anxious to have everything in order, and really it all looks very nicely, and we regard it quite complacently, as we take a final survey of our day's work. That star, which brought with her, covered by kind hands at home, shines out beautifully, surmounted by the green cross, and our lectern holds up its head, quite proud of itself in its Christmas vestments. But now we really must wind up, for the night has come, and with mutual good wishes for to-morrow's enjoyment, we say good night. As for the day itself, I can give you little account of that, as, of course, I could not be present, but the dinner was described to me in glowing terms by those who were. The turkeys, the pies, the plum puddings, the toasts that were given and drunk with 3 times 3 in beer, generously given for the purpose, in fact, everything seems to have passed off à merveille. But the best part of the whole was the orderly manner in which it was conducted, not a single case reported for the guard house. This pleased us especially, as it seemed to prove that our efforts for the men's enjoyment had been attended with no bad results, and to make the remembrance of our Christmas of 1862 one of the bright memories of our hospital experience. May God grant that ere we hail its dawn again, those now in rebellion may have returned to their allegiance, and thus enable us to proclaim a blessed peace throughout the land. But there is something first. Before peace must come prayer. We need prayer. The nation needs prayer. Do not point me to the little band of people or parishes where the daily offering is made, where throbbing hearts and souls, yearning for the safety of their loved ones, daily kneel before God's altar, and in lowliness and penitence send up that pleading wail, which seems as though it must pierce the very heavens, and cleave a pathway to the mercy seat. O most powerful and glorious Lord God, the Lord of hosts, that rulest and commandest all things, thou sittest in the throne, judging right, and therefore we make our address to thy divine majesty in this our necessity, that thou wouldst take the cause into thine own hand, and judge between us and our enemies. And again, hear us, thy poor servants, begging mercy and imploring thy help, and that thou wouldst be a defence unto us against the face of the enemy. Most thankful am I for this, and for all that we have, little as it is, but I am now looking at our country as a whole. We know the South to be wrong. We know ourselves, or rather our cause, to be right. If then we have right, truth, and justice on our side, why do we not succeed? Why have we not succeeded? Is it not that we are, a sinful people, pluming ourselves upon our powers, priding ourselves upon our prosperity, till we have come to look upon the fair beauty of this land, lavish in its loveliness, as a possession which is our right, and not as a loan, for the use and enjoyment of which we are bound to return the offering of grateful hearts? Is it not that we have gone on in a suicidal career of extravagance, luxury, and dissipation, which has finally brought its own punishment upon us? Sorely did we need humbling, and sorely have we been humbled. Bitter has been our lesson, but bitterly was it needed. The thought will sometimes arise, would that the trial had come from foreign foe; would that friend had never lifted hand against friend, nor brother against brother. Had that grand rising, at the sound of Sumter's wrong, which swelled throughout the North, had it, I say, but thrilled through our whole land with a mighty throb, till with one heart and hand united we had joined to defend that flag, so treacherously assailed, where is the foe we should have feared to face, and where the enemy which, humanly speaking, we might not have conquered? But so the lesson had been lost. We had but gained further food for pride, further motives for self-glorification. The medicine would but have increased the disorder, the remedy added to the disease. We must acknowledge, we must recognize the chastening hand which is dealing with us. Where is the victory which has ever yet, as a people, sent us to our knees? Where the defeat which has ever yet been attributed to any but secondary causes? Want of reinforcements, want of supplies, want of suitable weather, want of skill in the commanding officers, any and every want but the true one. We send our men forth wanting the one weapon which, springing from its scabbard and flashing in the bright sunlight of faith and trust, must ensure success. It is the sword of prayer. 'Tis prayer that moves the silver bowers afar, gains wings, and through the ever-opened door, swift as the image of the twinkling star, shows its reflection in the ocean's floor, it moves the inmates of that heavenly shore, as gently rippling o'er the leafy shade comes the soft, sighing gale, and passes o'er. E'en so in heaven each prayer, in secret made, ruffles 1,000 wings, prepared for instant aid. I humbly beg pardon, dear C. You ask for some account of our Christmas festivities at the hospital, and I have been betrayed into what I fear you will find a tedious expression of my feelings upon the questions which have such an absorbing interest at the present time. Forgive me this once, and I will promise to spare you in future. End of number 8. Number 9 of A Christmas Miscellany, 2017, by Various. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Number 9, Christmas Day on the High Seas, by Felix Riesenberg. Life was not always so pleasant on board the Fuller. Hard words were the common run of things, and the most frightful and artistic profanity often punctuated the working of the ship. Given a ship's company, barely strong enough to handle a 2,500-ton 3-skysail yarder, even had they all been seasoned, able seamen, our officers had to contend with a crew over half of which rated below that of the ordinary classification of seamanship, thick-skinned clodhoppers, all thumbs on a dark night, and for many weeks after leaving port, as useless as so much living ballast. The kicking and moulding into form of this conglomerate mass of deep-sea flotsam, gathered for the ship by the boarding-masters, and duly signed on the ship's articles as A.B., called for all but superhuman efforts. The curse is far more potent than the gentle plea, especially when hard fists and hobnailed sea-boots are backed by all the age-old authority of the sea. To work a ship of the proportions of the Fuller, with 17 hands forward, called for man driving without thought of anything but the work required. The latter days of the sailing ship as a carrier, before invoking the aid of steam auxiliary apparatus in the hoisting and hauling, brought forth the brute sea officer aft, and the hardened forecastle crowd, half sailor and half drudge, forward. The bucko mate walked her decks, and the jack-tar, stripped of his pigtail, his bell-mouthed canvas trousers, his varnished sailor hat, and his grog, remained in plain dungaree and cotton shirt to work the biggest sailing craft in the history of the world, on the last hard stages of their storm-tossed voyages. Mixed with our real sailors were the worthless, so far as sea-lore went, scrapings of the water-front, shipped by the boarding-masters for the benefit of their 3 months' advance, and furnished for sea with rotten kits of dunnage, as unreliable and unfitted for the work as the poor unfortunate dubs who were forced by an unkind fate to wear them. On the other hand, the real sailor-men of the crew were valued accordingly, and I can hardly remember an instance where either one of the mates singled out for abuse those men who had shipped as A.B., and were so in fact. My schoolship training, St. Mary's, '97, stood by me, and though barely turned 18, I was saved from most of the drudgery meted out to the farmers of the watch. After washing through the heavy seas, we encountered for the first few weeks of the voyage, while beating off the coast on the long reach eastward to the Azores, a long, hard pine sweep of the main deck became slippery with a deposit of white salt-water slime. The sheen of this scum in the moonlight, under a film of running water, gave the decks a ghastly Flying Dutchman-like appearance, and the footing became so precarious that something had to be done. "They have the bear out," Scoos announced, as he trudged into the forecastle, carrying a kid of cracker hash, ditto of Burgo, a can of coffee, and a bag of hardtack, this cargo of sustenance being our regulation breakfast menu. "The bear?" I asked, as we gathered about this appetizing spread. "Yes, the bear," volunteered Brendan, grinning with the rest of the sailors. "The bear for Scoos and Joe and Martin and Fred." At 8 bells, as we mustered aft, a subdued banter went on among the men. The starboard watch were all grinning, and as they went below, 4 sheepish-looking fellows of the other side turned the bear over to the farmers of our watch. "Keep that jackass baby carriage moving now, do you hear me? Keep 'em moving!" bellowed the mate, for there was some reluctance in taking hold, and as Scoos and Martin tailed on, opposed to Joe and Fred, the doleful scrape of the bear mingled with the general laughter at the mate's sally. The bear consisted of a heavy box, a thick thrum mat lashed on the bottom of it, and the inside loaded with broken holy stones and charged with wet sand. 4 stout rope lanyards were rigged to the corners and served to haul the thing back and forth, while the sand filtered down through the mat, providing the necessary scouring agent. A day or 2 with the bear in constant service, both day and night, cleaned up the decks and provided us with considerable amusement, that is, those of us who were lucky enough to be kept at more dignified jobs. Ships leaving the Atlantic coast in the winter months bend their best suit of sails. The severe weather usually encountered in working clear of the land, and the chance of having to ratch off from a lee shore, make this precaution one of great importance. The fact that green crews are bound to be more or less slow in taking in sail during squalls may also account for the storm suit under which we sailed from port. On our first night out, shortly before 1 bell in the mid-watch, our crowd having just gone below, the fore topmast staysails blew from the bolt ropes with the report of a cannon. We had already clambered into our bunks, dog-tired, when this occurred, and muttered oaths anticipating a call of all hands came from untold depths of weariness within the forecastle. On deck there was the hurried tramping of feet and the shouting of the second mate. We could hear the long wail of the men at brace and downhaul, the "ow-ee-ow-ee-ow," with all of its variation, as the slaves of the ropes launched their age-old complaint on the whipping winds. I lapsed into slumber with the dim consciousness that the second mate was handling the situation alone, and a heartfelt thanks for the warmth of the blankets in my narrow bunk. A foot above me the cold rain pattered against the roof of the forecastle house, its music mingling with the swish of the water under the fore channels. After 3 weeks of beating to the eastward, having fetched almost as far across as the Azores, and being in the region of the northern limit of the northeast trades, the captain hauled his wind and squared away for the run through the trade wind belt to the doldrums and the line. Fine weather became the order of the day, and life on board settled down to a more regular routine. On a Saturday morning, the day having broken remarkably fine, a brilliant red sunset followed by a cold grey dawn assured us of the settled weather that the steady glass made more certain. All the world seemed ready to rejoice, for it was Christmas Day. Word was passed into the forecastle by the other watch, as we turned out for our breakfast, "We shift sail to day." "All hands on deck for us, me boys," piped Australia. "And the first watch on deck to night," chipped in Jimmy Marshall, "and a hell of a Christmas Day." Jimmy lit his pipe for a morning puff. Climbing into his bunk, he dangled his short legs over the frowsy head of a big Scoos, who sat with his dejected poll bent under the upper bunk board, a fair sample of the despondent crowd of farmers who faced a Christmas Day of labor. "A hell of a Christmas Day, boys, a hell of a Christmas Day, for we are bound for the Bloody Horn, 10,000 miles away." Jimmy rendered this little ditty of cheerfulness as Fred picked up the breakfast kids and started for the galley, while we turned out on the sun-splashed planks as the last of 8 bells vibrated over the ship. She lay still in a near calm like a scene by Turner, all of her canvas hanging in picturesque festoons from the jackstays, where the starboard watch had cast off the courses and topsails, leaving them depending in their gear. The decks had not been washed down, in order to keep them dry, and the mate himself had turned out at 4 bells to start the ball rolling. Long bundles of the fine weather canvas were stretched on the decks, ready for swaying aloft. Working like demons in the forenoon, and with all hands on deck after dinner, which was dispatched in haste, we had the courses, and in turn the topsails and light sails lowered to the deck, and the gantlines rigged to hoist the summer canvas. This we sent aloft in record time. These old sails, soft and mellow, veterans of a dozen voyages, patched and repatched, with whole new cloths of a lighter grade here and there streaking the dull white weathered surface, were as smooth and pliable as a baby's bonnet. On some of them, the fore upper topsails especially, we found records of the many crews who had handled them before. "James Brine, Liverpool, on his last voyage," was one inscription. I hope Brine achieved his end and stayed ashore. A date under this was hardly decipherable, but may have been January, June, or July, the day the 8th, and the year 1893. Bending a sail calls for the nicest knowledge. The passing of the head earing must be done in a certain manner, so the head of the sail will hold well up on the yard arm. The gear, consisting of tacks, sheets, clew garnets, and bunt lines, in the case of a course, not to mention the leech lines and bow lines, must all be rove and rigged just so. The robins, or pieces of rope yarn, are all looped through the head holes, ready for bending the sail to the iron jackstay on the yard, and when a sailor does the job, all goes as smooth as a wedding when the parson knows his job. After the labours of a busy day, the ship presented the comfortable, well-patched appearance of a man in the woods, free from the stiffness of new white linen, and naturally fitting into the familiar folds of old duds. Unconventional, but plenty good enough. The bright spars still attested to her smartness, but we were in easy trade wind weather and dressed accordingly. The foresail was particularly large, with extra cloths in the leeches, made to catch and hold every breath of wind blowing over the deck. The sail locker was restowed with our best suit, and between the coils of canvas we liberally spread a bundle of old newspapers brought out by the mate. "To give the rats something to chew on," he remarked, as we ran the stiff new canvas in, tier upon tier. One thing that Frenchy called my attention to in the stowing of the locker was the fact that the storm canvas, lower topsails, and staysails were placed handy for immediate removal, the mate assuring himself of this fact by personal supervision. Indeed, he knew just where each particular sail was located in the locker, and could go in and lay his hand upon it in the darkest night, as he more than once demonstrated during the course of the voyage. That night a tired lot of men sat down to supper. The cold salt beef, the hard bread, and the can of tea came from the galley in their usual order. Fred, who was mess cook for that week, went back to the galley, after depositing the regulation Saturday night grub. As he left the forecastle door, he turned back at us with a grin on his wide, good-natured face, bristling with uneven outcroppings of yellow stubble. Fred reminded me of an amiable plodder hulking out in his dungaree jacket while the watch fell to on the beef and tack. "I guess he forgot to thank the cook for putting so many bugs in the tea," ventured Brendan. "Maybe he's going aft to take Christmas dinner with the captain in the cabin. They have a real plum pudding there. I saw it in the galley," said Joe. Plum pudding! Christmas! The thoughts of loved ones far away, and of those distant homes that perhaps were remembering some of us out on the broad bosom of the deep waters, came as a pang. All of us, I believe, felt this. For a moment or two silence ensued. Then Fred burst through the forecastle door with the big surprise. "Pie, boys, pie!" he shouted, depositing 3 tin plates on the forecastle deck, for we dined with the deck as a table, sitting about the kids on low benches. The precious pie was cut with the greatest regard for equality by no less an expert hand than that of Frenchy, assisted by Australia, who showed us how to cut a pie into 3 parts, by measuring across the diameter with a knife, adding a little to this, and then this length went 3 times into the circumference. Jimmy Marshall failed to agree with this theory, but was fairly beaten in the result, for Australia was right. The pie certainly was cut into 3 very equal parts. "An engineer in the mines showed me this," said Australia. "He says pi times across the pie is all the way around. Mathematics is what he calls this." Australia was nearly right at that, and the marks he made on the crust of the confections baked by Chow served as a reliable guide for Frenchy, also bolstering him immensely in the eyes of the more humble members of the port watch. That Australia chap certainly knew a thing or two, even if he was not the best sailor in the world. But Jimmy Marshall's comment was simply "Rats!" After supper, when pipes were glowing, and most of us sought our bunks for the hour or so that remained to us in the last dog watch, a discussion arose as to what kind of pie it was. Frenchy, the great gastronomic authority, claimed it was English currant pie. "They taste so bitter, that's why I know," he added, with an air of finality. Others differed with him. Skloot said it was red crabapple pie. Martin claimed it was nothing but plum pie. I thought it tasted like cranberry, but was not sure. At last, to settle the matter, and at the earnest request of the crabbed Jimmy, Fred trudged aft to the galley to consult Chow, and wind up the argument. He returned in triumph with a large tin can done up in a gaudy red label marked "Pie Fruit." Shortly after entering the northeast trades, we encountered the region of tropic rains, of daily thunderstorms, and of abundant drinking and washing water. We rigged an old sail over the gallows frame in the main deck to catch the rain, which was teamed through a canvas pipe to the main tank, a large upright iron cylinder standing on the keelson blocks in the main hold just abaft of the main mast. Our allowance of 3 quarts a day per man was anything but satisfying in the tropic atmosphere of the torrid zone. At least half of this whack of water went to the galley for use in the preparation of food, and the rest was divided between the scuttle-butt and the water barrel, from which it was drawn, sparingly, for washing purposes, usually a mere rinse to clean off the salt of a sea-water scrub. In the extreme heat, during the frequent periods of calm, our suffering through the lack of water became intense. The Fuller, like many other ships sailing from New York, put to sea with her water tank barely a quarter full, relying on the tropic rains to replenish the supply. When the rains did finally come, we fairly reveled in the luxury of abundant fresh water, drinking, washing clothes, bathing, and just plain wasteful wallowing in the refreshing element. With the first douse of rain, all hands turned out on deck to fill their pannikins under the spouting drains from the forward house. The conduct of a deep-water sailing voyage in the old days of wooden ships called for what today would be considered the highest type of scientific management. In the maintenance of the vessel, each part of the complicated fabric received its due attention at some particular point in the voyage, where the weather was favorable for that certain operation. So, in the entry to the rainy belt, that uncertain region of the doldrums, where almost constant precipitation takes turn about with calm or light baffling winds, we were turned loose on the job of scrubbing paintwork. The work was started aft, and each watch did its own side of the ship, there being much rivalry as to who was doing the most work. Everybody took a hand in this, and Brendan and Marshall would curse unmercifully at the job when well out of earshot of the after guard. Our hands became wrinkled with the constant wet, the calloused flesh getting soft and cheesy, while our oilskins, in which we worked during the worst downpours, became soaked and clammy through constant use. We were not allowed the bucket of classic "soojee" of the steamship sailor, a mixture of caustic soda, soft soap, and water, but were provided with nothing but a small tin of brick dust and a rag of burlap. A rope-handled deck bucket and a small swab completed the outfit. Add to this formula an abundance of elbow grease and slithers of tropic rain, and you get paintwork polished smooth and white as ivory. A week or so, with all hands on the paintwork, whenever the working of the ship would permit, transformed her into a model of neatness. Woe to the luckless wretch who by any chance marred the deck or paintwork with a drop of grease or tar. About this time we made our acquaintance with the flying fish, these swift travellers often shooting over our deck at night, and being caught in the belly of one of the courses or the spanker. A flying fish for breakfast is not bad, and many were caught by the men on deck, keeping a sharp lookout for them. The mates were also watching for the bag of flying fish, and whenever one landed on the poop or in the waist, one or the other of the mates would call out and have a hand bring the fish aft. One night a fish landed somewhere in the waist. We could hear the wet splatter of the flying fins, as it was calm and the deck quiet. Mr. Zirk, who was leaning against the weather swifter of the mizzen shrouds, roused himself and called out for some one to bring the fish aft. Several of the watch started to search for the visitor, for we also had heard him land, but without success. "How about that fish?" shouted the mate, after a decent interval, while the search was going on. "Can't find it, sir," Joe piped up. "The hell you can't!" thundered the mate. "There he is!" and again we heard a faint splash splash of the wings. "Get a light, you damn fools!" was the order, for it was mighty dark. "Come now, quick, pronto!" And as Scoose banged on the door of the deck room occupied by Chips in order to get him to open the lamp locker, we thought we heard the splash splash again. With the aid of a lantern and all of the watch, the entire deck was searched. Finally Jimmy Marshall let out a whoop. "Here he was! Here he was!" Some water on the deck, near the coils of rope hanging from the main pin rail, looked as though Jimmy was close to the flying fish. "Here he was!" again shouted the excited Jimmy, grabbing the lantern from the hand of Scoose. "Here he what?" demanded the mate, coming down into the waist. The mate bent over the wet spot and exploded in a string of oaths. "No flying fish ever made that! Here, you!" and he grabbed Jimmy. "This is some of your damn monkey shines, you old dried up bundle of sea tripe! Blank your gray hairs, I'll fly fish you! Lay aloft to the main skysail yard and watch the stars. I'll call you down on deck whenever we need you." For several nights after that Jimmy spent his time climbing up and down the main rigging, for no sooner would he get up than the mate would think of something to do that required his presence on deck. The flying fish episode furnished us with something to talk about in the forecastle, and while Jimmy always tried to leave the impression that the joke was on the mate and the rest of us, we felt that his over-zeal in discovering the puddle of water in which his clever hand had simulated the nervous flapping of the fins of a flying fish had turned the tables. My idea was that Jimmy, after seeing how well the thing was taking, could not resist the temptation to get the credit. We also harpooned our first bonita, a very active, virile fish, shaped like a short, double-ended spindle buoy, and striped lengthways. These fish are exceedingly lively, and jump about with terrific energy when brought on deck. Before taking this fish to the galley, Old Smith of the other watch, and Frenchy, and of course Jimmy Marshall, tested the meat with a silver coin, to see if it was of the poison variety. "If the silver turns black, the fish is poison," exclaimed Frenchy. In this case the bonita was pronounced good to eat, and a great feast was on that night. However, I never cared much for fish anyway, and did not touch it. Chow had certainly made an ill-looking mess of it, garnished with broken tack, and basted with pork fat. "You'll wisht you'd had a bit of this tucker before we get to Honolulu," was the comment of Joe, who proceeded to help himself liberally. End of Number 9.